Absolutism in Eastern Europe, Lecture 3.3. Okay, so let's start with an overview. The 6 Eastern European countries we're going to cover are known as HOPRAP. The 3 Asian empires are the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom, and those spell HOP, while RAP consists of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. In the Holy Roman Empire, otherwise known as the HRE, religious divisions due to the Reformation and religious wars in the 16th and 17th centuries split Germany amongst various Catholic princes. These were led by 3 different leaders and 3 different religions. One was Catholic with Charles V. The other was Lutheran with Martin Luther, and then in the middle here is Calvinist led by John Calvin. The Ottoman Empire led to its ultimate decline because it could not maintain possessions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in the face of these Austrian and Russian expansion. So the Ottoman Empire itself was based on expansion. Here the Sultan had absolute power in the empire, but after 1560, the decline in its western expansion resulted in this gradual disintegration of the empire. Suleiman Magnificent, I'm pretty sure I butchered that name, but he was perhaps the most powerful ruler in the world during that time in the 16th century, and he conquered Austria in 1529, and he captured Serbia, and he almost had half of Eastern Europe, including all the Balkan territories, most of Hungary, and part of southern Russia. The Janissary Corps, those were Christian slaves who were not selected for the Ottoman bureaucracy, so they served loyally instead of the Turkish Empire. And additionally, the Ottoman Empire, even though it doesn't say it here, they were fairly tolerant towards religion and its conquered provinces, but when it failed to conquer Vienna in 1683, after that, its decline in Eastern Europe was accelerated. So now for the Polish Kingdom. Okay, so what led to its decline was largely a policy called liberum veto, where the voting in the Polish parliament had to be unanimous for changes to be made. So therefore, nothing could or little could be done to strengthen the kingdom. Because it took so long to make changes, because everyone had to agree, little changes were made. The same could be said for in synthesis to modern day U.S. democracy, how they say Congress gets little done, and it's kind of criticized for that, because to have a democracy, there's people voting, so you can't just, one leader can't just decide to do something and the whole country follows that. It just has to have a discussion, and the system is extended and it takes a long time. So because of that, the inability of the Polish monarchy to consolidate its power over the nobility led to this Poland partition, where there was this foreign influence where Russia and Prussia, they encouraged members of Polish nobility to invoke that liberum veto and to weaken its country. So therefore, unfortunately, by 1800, Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state, and it was carved up by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Here on the next slide, there was 3 partitions of Poland, and you can see how this massive land decreases in each partition, one being 1772, the other 1793, and the last 1795, where those RAP countries, Russia, Austria, Prussia, each time they carved these big chunks of land out of Poland, and that led to that decline in the kingdom. So now, before going into those RAP countries, again, Russia, Austria, Prussia, I'm going to kind of sidetrack and just show the difference, or we'll learn more about absolutism and how it's different from Eastern European between French and even serfdom afterwards. So, in Eastern European, there was a really powerful nobility and a weak middle class, and it did have serfdom, where this oppressed peasantry was composed of serfs. Whereas France, it was quite the opposite. So the nobility's power had been limited, the middle class was relatively strong, and the peasants were generally free of serfdom. And here, King Louis, he built French absolutism upon the foundations of that medieval monarchy, like the Dark Ages, and that strong bureaucracy. So moving on to serfdom in Eastern Europe. So after 1300, lords in Eastern Europe, they revised serfdom actually to combat these increasing economic challenges. Because the drop in population in the 14th century, which is due to the Black Death, created these tremendous labor shortages that had a hard time for the nobles. So, because of this, lords demanded that their kings and princes issue laws that restricted a lot of the peasants' rights and therefore made them these serfs. Part of this, lords confiscated peasant lands, then they imposed heavier labor obligations. And serfdom in between 1500 and 1650, it was even strengthened, reinvigorated, was consolidated. And hereditary serfdom was even reestablished in Poland, Russia, and Prussia at the same time. And like in Poland, nobles gained complete control over peasants and could legally impose death penalties. In Russia, there was a 9-term limit on the recovery of runaway serfs, and this period they saw this growth of estate agriculture, especially in Poland and Eastern Germany. So why were these serfs in Eastern Europe and not in Western Europe? So serfdom in Western Europe wasn't as prominent because it wasn't as needed. Western Europe wasn't as devastated by the Black Death as the East, so there wasn't these labor shortages, and they could continue with the systems that were already in place. Okay, so now let's get back to those RAP countries, which are Russia, Austria, Prussia. So we'll start with the Austrian Empire. The rise of Austria. In Austria, the ruler was selected as the Holy Roman Emperor, and after the War of Spanish Succession, which ended in 1713, the Spanish throne was occupied by the Bourbons, so Habsburg power was really concentrated in Austria. And because of ineffective Habsburg rule, the Holy Roman Empire forced monarchs to turn their attention inward to consolidate their diverse holdings of land in separate provinces and create the strong unified state. So the reorganization of Bohemia was a major step towards absolutism. Centralization by Ferdinand III was really also important and key in making Austria such a dominant absolutist empire, because Ferdinand created a permanent standing army for the first time, and this was unprecedented for the Habsburg Empire. Oh, another thing to add about Austria was Austria was not a national state. It was a multinational empire. So in Bohemia, there was Czechs and Germans, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, and in Austria, proper, there were Germans and Italians. So no single constitutional system or administration existed in the empire, and each region had different a legal relationship to the empire. So this is important for later lessons. So just keep that in mind. Now we move on to the next slide. Here's some important Habsburg rulers of Austria. Okay, so Ferdinand III, I kind of talked about him. He centralized the Austrian government in the old hereditary provinces of Austria. Leopold I, in the middle here, he severely restricted Protestant worship, and at the Battle of Vienna, he successfully repelled Turks from the gates of Vienna in 1683. And this was the last attempt by the Ottoman Empire to take Central Europe. So this was the Ottomans' last go. Emperor Charles the Sixth. He so here Austria was saved from French expansion during the War of Spanish Succession due to its alliance with Britain and that military leadership of Prince Eugene. And Charles issued the Pragmatic Sanction, which is really important, in 1713. And here, Habsburg's possessions were never to be divided and henceforth to be passed intact to a single heir. And his daughter, Maria Theresa, inherited Charles' empire in 1740 afterwards, and she ruled for 40 more years. Okay, so moving on to Prussia. Here, Prussia, otherwise known as the House of Hohenzollern. I'm pretty sure I butchered that too. It's spelled Hohenzollern. Okay, so let's start with Frederick William, the Great Elector. He, the Great Elector, established Prussia as a great power, and this laid the foundation for the future unification in Germany, which would occur in the 19th century. Most significantly about him was he oversaw Prussian militarism. Oh, I can't say that. And he created the most efficient army in Europe. It's really important because Prussia's army was really small, but it was so powerful, and it was really strong. Additionally, he employed military power and taxation to unify his Rhine holdings, Prussia and Brandenburg, into a strong state. More with the military, Junkers formed the backbone of the Prussian military corps, and these were nobles and landowners that dominated the estates of Brandenburg and Prussia. Lastly, he did encourage industry and trade. So skilled craftsmen and Dutch farmers, they were imported, and new industries emerged, like woolens, cotton, linen, velvet, lace, soap, those type of things. And but efforts at overseas trade largely failed due to Prussia's lack of ports and naval experience. Okay, let's get into some of these rulers of Prussia. So Frederick the First, a lot of these have similar names, like Frederick versus Frederick William versus Frederick William the First versus Frederick the Second. So I put like what they were known as on the bottom to maybe you could differentiate them. Frederick the First was known as the Ostentatious, otherwise known as like the first king of Prussia. He was one of the most popular Prussian kings, and he sought to imitate the court of King Louis in France. He encouraged higher education, he founded universities, and he actually fought against the French in 2 wars to preserve the European balance of power. And these were the 9 Years' War that ended in 1697 and the War of Spanish Succession that ended in 1713. And here he was allied with the Habsburg, and at the Treaty of Utrecht for the War of Spanish Succession, he was internationally recognized as the King of Prussia in return for the aid to the Habsburg. So that's why he could also be known as the first King of Prussia. Frederick William I, otherwise known as the Soldiers' King, he was the most important regarding the development of Prussian absolutism. He was a Calvinist. He infused military into Prussian society. He became known as like this Sparta of the North. And like what was said about Prussia was like, quote, Prussia is not a state with the army, but an army with the state, unquote. So Prussia, remember, this is big military power. That's something you really want to remember Prussia by. Now moving on to Frederick II, Frederick the Great. He was one of the most powerful and famous Prussian kings. He was really big on the Enlightenment ideas. So if you see like the Enlightenment lecture, he's a big part of that. So he incorporated these ideals into his reign. So he instituted a number of important reforms, and he increased Prussia's territory at the expense of the Austrian Habsburg. Okay, so now last part of the wrap. Russia kind of went in a weird order. But okay, so Russia. A big part of Russia was this leader, Peter the Great. When you think of Russian absolutism, you must remember Peter the Great. So, Peter the Great, one thing that was striking about his reign was, again, similar to Prussia, this military power was a great concern. There was like 75% of the national budget was spent on military by the end of Peter's reign. So that's just emphasizing how much that military strength was valued. The Great Northern War that ended in 1721 was Russia versus Sweden, and here it ended with the Treaty of Nystad. It's spelled Nystad, where Russia gained Latvia and Estonia, and thus he gained its window on the west in the Baltic Sea, which led to Peter's. He's one thing to remember. Another thing to remember about him is westernization and like that modernization that made him westernization a major focus when he gained these lands, because he could view more of the West, you know. So he traveled west to study technology and culture, and connecting modernization with militarism. Military technology was actually his primary concern. So he imported to Russia substantial numbers of Western technicians and craftsmen to aid in building of large factories to get Russia caught up with the West. And even by the end of his reign, Russia outproduced England in iron, so which is really surprising. Although Sweden and Germany still were ahead, England was a big country in that, and they were able to outproduce them. Serfdom did exist in factories where workers could be bought and sold, so that hadn't gone away. And the government was a lot more efficient with this absolutist rule. Okay, so now moving on to the table of ranks. It was a set educational standards for civil servants, most of them who were nobles. And here, Peter sought to replace the old nobility with the new service based on nobility loyalty to the Tsar. As far as St. Petersburg, this city was one of Peter's crowning achievements. He sought to create a city similar to Amsterdam in his palace. So, by his death, the city was the largest in Northern Europe, and St. Petersburg did become the capital of Russia. Okay, and I think we're done here. That's absolutism in Eastern Europe. Remember, like a quick conclusion. Remember Hoprat, whereas the three aging empires were the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Polish Kingdom. The three rising empires, Russia, Austria, Prussia. And here, if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much.